One piece of evidence changed everything after 25 years. There was a small piece of fabric sitting in an evidence bag for 25 years. It wasn't much to look at. Just a torn corner of what might have been a shirt or a jacket. It was dirty, faded, and had been logged back in 1997 as possible trace evidence. At the time, nobody thought it was particularly important. There were no obvious bloodstains on it. No fingerprints. It was just one more item in a box full of items from a crime scene that had gone cold. The victim was a 31-year-old woman named Rebecca Lang. She had been killed in her apartment in a small city in Pennsylvania. The case was investigated for a few months, but leads dried up and it eventually went cold. For 25 years, that box sat in storage. Detectives came and went. Some read the file, shook their heads, and moved on. The small piece of fabric stayed in its bag, forgotten by almost everyone. Then, in 2022, a detective named Detective James Keller decided to take another look at the case. He wasn't even officially assigned to it. He was just going through old files during a slow period. When he opened Rebecca's box and saw that piece of fabric, something made him stop. He sent it to a lab that used technology that didn't exist in 1997. Within a few months, that one small, ordinary piece of fabric gave them a name. Not just a name, but answers. It connected a suspect who had been living freely for a quarter of a century. It changed everything. This isn't a story about a case that was worked hard from the beginning. This is a story about how one overlooked piece of evidence can sit quietly for decades, until someone finally decides to look at it with fresh eyes and better technology. Today on Shadow Files, we're going to walk through the murder of Rebecca Lang. We're going to look at why the case went cold so quickly, what everyone missed for 25 years, and how one small piece of fabric finally brought justice after all that time. Disclaimer. Before we continue, I want to be clear. We tell these stories with respect for the victims and their families. We focus on the facts and the investigation process. We will not sensationalize violence or treat these cases as entertainment. These are real people, and we handle their stories with the care they deserve. Rebecca Lang was 31 years old in the spring of 1997. She lived in a small two-bedroom apartment in Reading, Pennsylvania. She worked as a nurse's aide at a local nursing home and was known in her community as a hardworking, reliable woman who kept to herself. She had been divorced for about 3 years and was raising her 8-year-old daughter, Emily, mostly on her own. Her ex-husband lived in another state and didn't have much contact with them. People who knew Rebecca described her as quiet but kind. She worked long hours and spent most of her free time with her daughter. She didn't go out much at night and didn't have a large social circle. Her life was simple and centered around providing for Emily and making ends meet. On the evening of April 11, 1997, Rebecca finished her shift at the nursing home around 7 p.m. She picked up Emily from the babysitter and went home. Around 8:30 p.m., she spoke briefly on the phone with her sister. She mentioned that Emily had a school project due the next day and that she was planning to help her with it before bed. That was the last confirmed conversation anyone had with her. The next morning, Rebecca didn't show up for work. Her co-workers tried calling her apartment. No answer. By mid-morning, when she still hadn't come in and nobody had heard from her, her supervisor started to worry. She called Rebecca's emergency contact, her sister, who then drove over to check on her. When the sister arrived, she knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the handle and found it unlocked. She went inside and called out for Rebecca. There was no response. She checked the living room and kitchen. Everything looked normal. Then she checked the bedroom. What she found changed her life forever. Rebecca had been killed inside her apartment. The scene showed signs of a struggle, but it didn't look like a typical robbery. Some items were out of place, but nothing valuable appeared to be missing. It felt personal. The sister immediately called 911. Police arrived quickly and secured the scene. Detectives began processing the apartment. They collected fingerprints, took photographs, and looked for any signs of forced entry. The front door didn't show any damage, which suggested that either Rebecca had let the person in or they had a key. There were no obvious signs of a break-in through the windows either. In 1997, DNA technology was still relatively new and not widely used in routine investigations. Especially in smaller departments, they collected several items that might have had biological material on them, including a small piece of fabric that was found near the bedroom. It looked like it might have come from a shirt or jacket. There were no obvious bloodstains on it, and at the time, it didn't seem particularly important. It was logged as possible trace evidence and put into storage with everything else. The initial investigation focused on people Rebecca knew or had interacted with recently. They spoke with her coworkers, her ex-husband, who had a solid alibi, and people who lived in the apartment complex. One name that came up was a man named Thomas Reed, who had done some maintenance work in the building a few weeks earlier. A neighbor mentioned seeing him talking to Rebecca in the hallway on a couple of occasions. When police questioned him, he denied any involvement and claimed he had been at home with his girlfriend the night Rebecca was killed. Without strong physical evidence or witnesses who could place anyone at the scene, the investigation stalled. After several weeks, the case began to lose momentum. Other crimes were happening in the city, and resources had to be redirected. By the end of 1997, Rebecca Lang's murder had officially gone cold. For her young daughter Emily, life changed forever. She was only 8 years old when her mother was killed. She went to live with relatives and grew up with very few memories of her mother. Every year on the anniversary of Rebecca's death, the family would talk about her. But as time passed, even those conversations became less frequent. Rebecca's name started to fade from daily life. Over the next 25 years, her case file sat in storage. A few detectives pulled it out during slow periods and reviewed it. But nothing new ever surfaced. The evidence collected in 1997 was limited by today's standards. And without better technology, there wasn't much anyone could do. The file would go back on the shelf, and the case would remain unsolved. Meanwhile, Thomas Reed continued living his life. He got married, had children, and built a normal existence. He had a few minor run-ins with the law over the years, but nothing that connected him back to Rebecca's case. He probably thought he had gotten away with it. Then, in early 2022, Detective James Keller was going through old storage rooms during the department reorganization. He came across a box labeled with Rebecca Lang's name and case number. Out of curiosity, he took it back to his desk and started reading through the file. As he looked through the old reports and photographs, one thing caught his attention: that small piece of fabric that had been collected near the bedroom in 1997. It had never been fully tested because the technology at the time wasn't sensitive enough to pull usable DNA from something so small and degraded. But Detective Keller knew that modern touch DNA technology could now analyze even tiny amounts of skin cells. He sent the fabric to a specialized lab. Months passed. Then, in late 2022, the lab called with results. They had recovered a partial DNA profile from the fabric. It didn't match Rebecca or anyone in her family. When they ran it through the system and later through a genetic genealogy database, it matched a family line that included Thomas Reed. Detectives obtained a warrant and collected a fresh DNA sample from Thomas Reed, who was now in his late 50s. When they compared it to the evidence from 1997, it was a match. Faced with the DNA evidence, Thomas Reed eventually confessed. He admitted that he had gone to Rebecca's apartment that night because he had become obsessed with her after doing work in the building. He said things had escalated and he had killed her. He had tried to make it look like a robbery and had gone back to his normal life afterward. In 2023, Thomas Reed was arrested and charged with Rebecca Lang's murder. He was convicted later that year and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Rebecca's daughter Emily, who was now in her mid-30s, the resolution brought a complicated but necessary sense of closure. She had grown up with almost no memories of her mother and had lived most of her life knowing that whoever killed her had never been caught. After 25 years, she finally had answers. She was able to visit her mother's grave and tell her that someone had finally fought for her. Detective James Keller has said that this case taught him how important it is to never completely give up on old investigations. He believes that many cold cases from the 90s could still be solved if departments are willing to re-examine old evidence with today's technology. One small piece of fabric that sat in a bag for 25 years ended up being the key that unlocked everything. Rebecca Lang's story is a powerful reminder that even when a case has been cold for decades, one piece of evidence can still change everything. It shows that justice can be delayed for a very long time. But it doesn't always have to be denied. Sometimes it just takes the right person, the right technology, and the willingness to look at something everyone else had overlooked. Thank you for watching this episode of Shadow Files. These kinds of cases show us that even after many years, answers can still be found. If this story moved you, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, as long as you keep them respectful. We'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself.